Mark Collins,
What's up?
welcome back, dude.
Second time. Round two.
Second time. Yeah, you're one of the OG people, man. You're one of like the very first fucking
Yeah.
episodes, man.
Is there anybody else that's been on a second time yet? Or am I the
Yeah, I've had
first?
I've had some
Okay.
threes. I had Ian Rafalco on 3 times. Dr. Jordan Goldstein's been on 3 times. Fellow Canuck.
Okay,
Uh,
yeah.
I-
Well, not anymore. He's
oh yeah,
he's
yeah, dude.
run south.
Fair
Yeah.
enough. Fair enough. Yeah, I'm actually running a race with him. I do an ultra with him in Zach Homall and that whole crew in
Nice.
Indiana. That whole Prairie on Fire backyard ultra. That's gonna be a good time.
Yeah, I was supposed to go get some trail runs in with Jordan in the summer when I was working up in the Toronto area, but we just couldn't make it work for various different reasons.
Yeah, he
it's-
ghosted me too. I flew up to Toronto and I tried to connect him. He's like, you're not important enough to me to hang out with. So I'm like, I get you. I see you, Jordan.
Yeah. Well, you should have let me know when you were coming up to Toronto. I mean,
Man,
yeah.
I
busy.
didn't even know you were in Toronto. I just knew you're Canadian. I didn't even know where you're
Yeah.
based out of. So now I know.
Southwestern Ontario. I'm not in Toronto. I was just working there last year for about 6 months.
Oh, got it.
Yeah.
Yes, you have to understand, like Americans, like we view Canada as just like one thing. It's just like, I don't know. It's up there somewhere.
Okay.
There's like a handful of cities we know, but have no idea, like geographically where they sit or what language they speak. It's fun. It's fun being an ignorant American.
Yeah, well, we'll talk about that a bit later. Yeah, I mean, the big news: John McAfee apparently
Yeah.
back from the dead. Somehow John McAfee returned. To borrow that line from
That was
Star
a
Wars.
wild tweet. For a while before I knew what that was about, I was like, "What?"
Yeah.
I started to getting a little conspiratorial in my own head.
Well, and then I was just looking up before we hopped on here that like his wife's posting stuff that like yeah his account hasn't been hacked or anything, and it's like I thought he committed suicide a couple years ago, so it's
Well, I thought she clarified. I thought this was like some sort of AI thing. Like my understanding of this is like the AI encapsulation of all that is McAfee, but I could be wrong.
I mean that would be interesting, right? Like I wonder if John McAfee is this big thing that OpenAI keeps teasing. You know what I mean? Like somehow they've achieved super intelligence by uploading John McAfee.
Boy, I sure don't think so. But
I don't think so either, but you know, it's not outside the realm of possibility with that guy.
yeah,
It's-
nothing is. That's the thing about it. When I first saw the tweet, I mean, that dude is so wild, and he's so
Yeah.
deep into all of this.
Just
He's on the wrong side of multiple governments. Like
yeah,
he's deep in the security space, and you just never know with that dude what's going on. Like
No.
it's kind of like Epstein, man. He disappears, and you always got to wonder, like,
is
or
he gone
Bin
for
Laden
good?
or whoever. Like, maybe they're just kind of alive somewhere. Who the hell knows?
Yeah. I mean, it's like you can't even do a movie about him. It's got to take a whole TV series because there's just, there's so much there of like,
We don't have that many interesting people anymore. It feels like McAfee was one of the last ones that was like a really unique, interesting dude.
yeah,
It's one of those things that like it makes me sad a little bit that there's not more people that are just complete wild men like that.
You know what? I think with space opening up as a frontier, you're gonna see it more, right? You're gonna have like once we start putting people on the moon and people on Mars and people in whatever space stations orbiting planets, etc., etc. I mean, you and I probably won't be alive necessarily to see that develop to this point, but you're gonna see people who want to push out to the frontier, and they're gonna be, just like you have all your people that conquered the New World. There's going to be people making some names for themselves out there, and some of them are going to be for good things, like first person to colonize Mars or discover some rock or whatever, and some of them are going to be notorious outlaws. That's the frontier.
Yes, maybe we'll get some of that. Like as new frontiers expand, maybe some more wild men will emerge, man. Because it's been sad. There just isn't a bunch. It feels like everyone is super conformist, and it's particularly with social media. I think you see this pressure to conform socially. There's this that's a lot of friction to get past that point. I feel like there is a point where you can be like, fuck it. I really do. I think there are people that can escape velocity. I think one of those people is Rick Rubin. Rick Rubin he's based as hell. Like he says some wild shit. Like I don't know if you know, but he's his personal doctor is Dr. Jack Cruz, who is really famous neurosurgeon, and he is super smart, but he is definitely against the grain when it comes to some shots and when it comes to some certain
Yeah.
medical orthodoxy, and Rick just seems to have achieved escape velocity. He's just a beloved character. He's creative, he's wild, he's unique, he's out there. And it seems like there's a lot of friction now because of the social pressure, and nobody really seems to want to push through that, to just be like, fuck it, I'm just gonna do my own thing and let the chips fall where they may.
Yeah, I mean, I know a few, but they're not, like, some of them are big on Instagram. Like, I know, for some reason they're all arborists that I know, but they're always,
What? Like tree people?
yeah, they're, you know what, they're a group of people that a couple of years ago I would have dismissed as like just cowboys or whatever, but I've gotten to know a few of them, and they're some of the nicest, best people on the planet. But they're always out there doing wild stuff because their job is super dangerous, right? Like, I know a guy, Johnny Corthius. I had him on the podcast. He spent the summer out in a helicopter flying from remote location to remote location in BC to like do some tree health stuff, right? Just camping out under the stars for weeks at a time with nobody around for hundreds of kilometers in any direction, right? Just climbing trees. So there are people like that out there. They're just hard to find. And I like, unlike John, somebody like John McAfee achieved a certain level of notoriety because he was just like the business space and everything like that, right? So, and that was pre-social media.
Yeah, and then before that, the only one I can really think of that was at that level was like a Hunter S. Thompson, and that was
or like our Ernest Hemingway.
Yeah.
Like the classical writers. Yeah, one of the wildest things I saw John McAfee do, and it might not sound like it to some people, but he had a bottle of Pappy Van Winkle, which, if you know anything about bourbon, like, that's an expensive bottle of bourbon, right? That stuff is so hard to get a hold of. There's wait lists, like, it's a whole ordeal to get it. And he did a video where he was mixing it with Diet Coke on the rocks. Everybody's like, "What are you doing?"
Probably got some cocaine on his nose and hasn't wiped off yet. Like, yeah, I've seen those videos.
Yeah, but it's like, if you got the money, I guess, it's your bourbon. Go for it. But like, all the purists, and myself included, were like, why? Why would you do that? Right?
Because he's John McAfee. That's why.
John McAfee doesn't care. It's like, I don't care what you think whatsoever. Just doing my thing. But yeah, I don't know. We'll see what it actually is like. Because of generative AI and all that, it's going to be real hard to convince people that he is actually back from the dead.
For sure. Yeah, I think it's probably likely that the dude is dead, but you never really know.
Yeah. But it would be funny, though, if he was the OpenAI supercomputer. That would be kind of interesting.
It certainly would, but boy, I would. It feels like that would go so off brand for him too. I think his wife would realize that would be antithetical to his legacy.
Yeah, I mean, you look at some of the stuff Larry Ellison said, and you see that like John McAfee would be the polar opposite of everything that Larry Ellison stands for.
Larry's CIA, man.
Yeah.
Do you know that? Do you know the history of Oracle?
I don't know it necessarily all that well. Like, to me, because I'm not a tech guy, Oracle's just a name that I see sponsor like Red Bull or Sail Grand Prix or whatever, right? So I'm vaguely aware of them. But
yeah, so Oracle, the name of the company, actually came from this is all declassified now. This is all in public domain, but this is a CIA project code name, Oracle. And it was around, it's a relational database. That's what he built for them, right? So they wanted a better way to warehouse data and index and search it, right? So Larry has been tight with the CIA for a very long time, and so yeah, he's got a history.
That's why he loves the AI surveillance stuff.
Oh yeah. What's weird is how he talks about it in a positive sense too. He's kind of like, we're going to have this dystopian CCP type of future. Where you have no privacy and everyone's going to know what you're doing. Ha ha, LOL. Yeah. And it's like, no.
You know what though? Can I just say this? For a guy that's 80, he looks really good.
Well, you got,
Yeah,
you're like a fourth richest person in the world. I'm sure you got some stuff, right? You got some
yeah,
people, you got some stuff, you got some protocols, you got a trainer, whatever. Like they're,
yeah,
they're probably sucking the blood out of fetuses and, transforming it and injecting it into his veins somehow,
yeah,
vampire style. But yeah, I agree. Like for 80, dude looks
yeah.
pretty good.
We got to give him at least one positive thing, I guess.
There you
Yeah,
go. Gotta be
yeah,
balanced.
yeah. I mean, so I guess let's talk about that because he came up with that announcement with Sam Altman from OpenAI the
Yep.
other day, which, at this point, was that Wednesday the 22nd that they did that? Was that yesterday?
I don't know. I still
Tuesday?
have PTSD from it. I saw the announcement about fell out, and also it didn't surprise me a bit too. I was one of those. If you watch my Twitter feed, man, I was one of the first people out there being like, "Told you so,
Yeah,
told you so." If you watched me before the election, I'm like, "This is coming."
yeah. What they announced, like this building a $500 billion data center to tailor make mRNA vaccines and pharmaceuticals. Like,
Individualized.
yeah. Um, First of all, those people are not the kind of people that should ever have that power. Neither him nor Sam Altman. Right? Nothing they've done so far gives anybody confidence that they would do anything but evil, evil stuff with that kind of power. Second of all, from the sounds of it, they don't even have the money to build that thing. Um,
What do you mean they don't have the money? Because this is what scares me being an American, right? Like I know, different countries have different views on this, but this is just state socialism. This is straight up. This is a joint venture, meaning this is a public-private partnership, which is just fascism. This is straight up corporatism.
it's my understanding the U.S. government's not committing money to it. It's all private money going into it, and
Where'd you see that? Because that's not what I read.
Trump was talking about it today. He was doing a press conference thing today, and he kind of made an off the cuff remark about.
I wonder. Well, first of all, let's be clear
Yeah,
here. There's no bill, right? So
yeah,
Congress has to appropriate
yeah,
funds, right? So this is currently being floated by Trump and his proxies, right? So
yeah,
that's important to note. So there's
yeah,
not even a framework. There's no bill. There's no funding. None of that stuff. But initially, what I had heard in the original press release was this is a joint venture, a public-private partnership funded by the government. Now he might have backed off because if you paid attention to Twitter, his base went what the fuck, like in
yeah.
unison. The entire MAGA community, which I don't have a lot of regard for, they were just like, "This isn't what we voted for," and I was like, "Well, yeah, it actually is." But
Um, yeah, it sounded to me because when he was talking about, I think it was today, he had a little off the cuff remark, which was he said it's all private money, and I think they're just um, speeding up the permitting process and the development, cutting through the red tape to allow it to get built faster. I think
hold on,
that's
what private money is going to be generating $500 billion of capital? That is insane.
SoftBank apparently. But this is what like Elon was talking about that they they can barely scrape together 10 billion of the 500 billion they need. So like it sounds like they don't have the money and it's just one of those wish list things of like this has happened multiple times with OpenAI where they've promised these huge things and then they've turned around and oh, it's not actually that. So it wouldn't surprise me if this was one of those things where they kind of put the cart before the horse a little bit.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Well, who knows? But it's disturbing to say the least, man. Like I saw
Yeah.
that and I was pretty shook.
Yeah. Definitely one of those things that like everybody should be concerned about, right? Like that's not the kind of project you want going forward. Like that's
What do you think about them calling it a vaccine, man?
it's idiotic.
Is
Like
it though?
Well, it's because they've changed the definition of vaccines. I guess it would technically fit. Like they changed the definition during COVID. Um, but as was pointed out, I think Dr. Vinny Prasad, who's been kind of a voice of reason on a lot of the COVID stuff, he
Oh,
pointed
really?
out.
You think that he's a voice of reason? Boy,
Well,
I hold him in deep contempt. Boy, I'd
can,
like to find out why we differ there.
well, compared to most of the medical establishment, right? To me, the medical establishment is completely debased themselves, right? And
Yeah,
very
that's a
few.
low bar. That's like
I
being
know.
the fastest person at the Special Olympics, man. Like,
I don't agree with a lot of what Vinny has said, but he brought up an interesting point here with like how this AI is supposed to theoretically tailor all these mRNA vaccines, which is, first of all, you're going to have to get the AI to go through all of the studies that have been done on cancer research, right? That's hundreds of thousands of studies. And then 50% of them or more are complete nonsense. And how do you separate them? Well, you're going to have to go through and test each one by one, recreate the conditions, recreate the study completely to prove whether it works or it doesn't work. So right there, you're talking hundreds of billions of dollars worth of research that you're going to have to do before, just to get your AI to understand cancer, right? And then when you get somebody in there, you still have to subject them through a battery of tests. And then, even then there's no certainty on like which type of cancer you're looking at. So how an AI is ever going to be able to figure that out, let alone figure it out well enough to tailor make a vaccine, or gene therapy, I guess would be the actual word for it. Like it's just never going to work. It's never going to functionally be feasible. I mean, each shot would be billions of dollars because you'd have to have all the research in there, right? Like it's just never going to work.
Well, assuming that they're going to be safe and effective, which we know the history there.
Yeah.
My point, what I was trying to angle at, is the reason in the United States, and you may not know this being Canadian, when you call something a vaccine, when it gets classified as a vaccine, you're no longer eligible for liability, meaning the people that get injured by the vaccine can't sue, right? Yeah. So in the United States, under Ronald Reagan, all the vaccine manufacturers said like, hey, we can't keep making this stuff because the liability associated with it, because it's not a safe product. And please don't get me wrong, I'm not like crazy anti-vaxxer, but every medical intervention has a certain number of people that become injured by it. They have a reaction. There's a bunch of different things that people can have some sort of negative health outcome that could potentially induce liability. And the manufacturers are like, there's no profit margin in this. We're not going to keep doing this. And so Reagan instituted a vaccine court, where essentially you go into this system and maybe you get something out of it, maybe you don't. But the manufacturers have blanket liability. The government pays out claims for the vaccine injuries. So the fact that they are taking something which is clearly not vaccine in a traditional sense and trying to label it that way, that's my first red flag that something is like majorly wrong here.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the other thing is you'd have to go through safety trials, right? So from the time that it tailor makes the shot to the time that you could inject it, it would have to go through the entire run of safety trials, which should be years long before you can even inject the shot. So it's like, unless you're going to change the laws, but then you're into all kinds of horrible things right there, right? And I hope RFK, I hope they confirm him for HHS secretary, and he does do away with that vaccine liability shield.
Spoiler alert, he won't. I'm going on record right now. I'm on the public internet about this. You go ahead and bookmark this. He's not going to.
Yeah. I think I'm inclined to agree with you there. I think that lobby is way too strong.
Yep.
And it's, I think there would be a lot of bodies in the ground before that ever sees the light of day. Now, I mean, when you go into the history of vaccines, right, I'm with you. I'm not blanket like all of them are bad, but you go into the history of individual vaccines and you find it like, oh yeah, they didn't get them right the first try. Everybody brings up the polio vaccine, but it was like, that was decades of work and products pulled off the market because they were killing people and this and that, right? It was like the 8th or 9th try that they finally got one that worked.
Well, and you mentioned that polio vaccine. Have you been sort of read into literature on SV40?
No, I haven't.
Look into that. That was one of those things that I'm not sure if you saw this podcast. It was one of the best podcasts I've seen in years. It was Danny Jones' podcast, and it had Jack Cruz, and it had Mary Bowden on it with Callie Means.
Okay.
It was absolutely intense, and I learned so much about that. I didn't know what SV40 was, and I wasn't aware of the huge incidence of cancer that's associated with SV40. The simian virus 40 is DNA fragments that have been incorporated into these shots, and you can track over time incidences of cancer. And apparently, this SV40 is also in some of the mRNA COVID shots as well. And so I didn't realize this until recently. I started looking into some of this data, and I'm not a scientist, but the stuff that I've seen is pretty plausible that this is a pretty bad thing. And like I said, this is not to be saying anything negative about vaccines in a blanket way, but it just reinforces what we're talking about. Like, anytime you have a medical intervention like this, there's going to be people that get injured by it. There's going to be people that have reactions, and on net, it's not great that there's no liability for manufacturers, because they don't necessarily care anymore. Because if they're not on the hook for the liability, what incentive do they have to make sure that they're safe? Because they can point at the regulatory agencies and say, "Oh, it's your job to protect, FDA or whoever. It's your job to protect the citizens from faulty medicines or whatever." But ultimately, if you know the way that works in the United States, it's really corrupt. So, for example, the FDA doesn't even get to see the actual data. Right, the data that is being used by Pfizer and Moderna and these companies to sort of do their efficacy and safety testing, they get a summary of it. They get a report out of it. They don't get to look at the actual source data, which is like a huge problem. So it's sort of like, trust me, bro. And then we have this sort of weird thing in America where we have this revolving door between the regulatory agencies and the pharma companies. If you know the mechanics of it, it's actually really gross.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that, because it's the same thing with the defense industry. Right. Yeah, that was one of the things that bothered me on Trump's campaign trail, is that he kept espousing the virtue of Operation Warp Speed. I was
it's his crowning achievement of his first term. He is boosted and vaxxed to the gills, and he loves that damn thing. It's very weird.
Yeah, it's weird because it's like the one thing that he is completely at odds with the rest of his base on. And it's weird that he keeps bringing it up, because you see it every time in the rallies. He brought it up, and the crowd would just go silent.
And he's got contempt for his base about it too. Because I've seen him in interviews saying, like, because he'll be with like maybe a left-leaning, legacy media type outlet like CBS or something. Yeah. And he'll be like, I really can't say that I love the vaccine because it's not popular with my base or whatever. Like, you can tell that he's pissed. Like, he's like, this is, look what I did. I did all this great work. I delivered this on time or faster than ever, and all that. This is the greatest thing ever. And his ego just can't let him get past the fact that this thing was terrible. Yeah.
And that was one of those things with it where they rushed the product out because politicians needed the product to deliver a win. And the politicians were willing to, like you said, waive the liability completely. So pharmaceutical companies were like, yeah, here's a thing that maybe does the job. It's on you to sell it. You wanted it.
Fuck you, Marcus. 92% effective. Oh, I'm sorry, 83%, 70 to 40, 12% of. Yeah. Jesus, you see that cut up of that of the mainstream media when they were reporting out and it's like that cut up. By the time they get down, it's like, it doesn't work at all. Sorry.
Well,
folks.
I mean, that was the thing, right? By the time you get to shot 4, you've got protection for like 20 minutes, but it comes at a cost of like a ruthlessly diminished immune system, right? Like, it was pointless. And I mean, speaking of that, we're coming up on the 3rd anniversary of the Freedom Convoy here in Canada.
Oh, yeah. That was, man, I got to say, man, I probably said it on our last episode. It's like, I was so proud of y'all because Americans didn't do shit. Americans they watched Netflix and they sat home and they're like, fuck it. At least you guys were out in the streets doing something, man.
And you know what? Most successful peaceful protest in history.
That's how you do it.
By a wide margin. And the fact that it was, because I was there in Ottawa the first weekend that it happened, it was like -30 out there. Like, it was freezing, and that's before we even get to the wind chill. It was so cold. Like, I had my Baffin boots on, and my feet were still cold, and those things are rated down to -20. Like, it was, yeah. But people were still there. Trucks were still there. Everybody was still out, and that just kind of tells you how important it was, right? It's like, hey, this is...
but then grandma got her bank account shut down by Trudeau, man. Like, that was some wild times.
Yeah, that was Still pissed about it. That should have been the end of the Trudeau government right there. 3 years ago when they tried to bring in the Emergencies Act. Well, they succeeded in it, but that right there, they implemented it illegally. This came out. They did an inquiry on it because that's part of the act. Is within a year, there has to be an inquiry to go through the facts of the case. Right, all public. The agency responsible for determining whether the act should be implemented or not is the Canadian Intelligence Services, CSIS, and they were very clear about it in the inquiry that there was no threat that warranted the Emergencies Act. So therefore, its implementation was illegal, and that should have been the end of the Trudeau government right there.
But it wasn't. Spoiler alert.
And here we are 3 years later.
Hey, eventually got him though. What? Tell me about that. Like, what's going on? I know that I don't stay really close to the details here, but I saw him stepping down, and I think the whole, this side of the line was just like, oh, thank God, like that about time.
Yeah. He hasn't stepped down. He's signals his intention to step down.
And he's on his way out though, right? Unless I'm missing something important, but he's on that. He's hitting the exits, right?
It's hard to say.
Ooh, tell me more.
Okay. Well, like, first of all, you have to understand Canada, right? As a nation. Because we, geographically, we're very similar to the United States. We share a common lineage with, like, Western European settlers, right? British, French, Spanish. We share that common lineage, common language, common enough culture. There's a few minor cultural differences, but it's close enough that generally you can mesh Canadians and Americans together, no problem, right? And Canada is this country that's vast, like it's the second largest country on the planet. It's unmatched beauty, right? You go from coast to coast, from Newfoundland and the Maritimes to Northern Ontario, to Saskatchewan and Manitoba, Alberta, like through the Rockies, to even the high Arctic. It is one of the most beautiful places on the planet. And underneath all that, we have this vast, untapped mineral wealth that could make us the richest country on the planet. The potential here is limitless, and all of that is run by some of the most retarded people to have ever walked the face of the earth. Like,
how dare you? These people created poutine. I will not let you denigrate that entire.
The people that created poutine and the people that run the country are two very different groups of people.
Fair enough. Right? Fair enough. I'll allow it.
The people that run the country couldn't even put poutine together. And it would cost them $10 billion to not even get it together. So with Trudeau, the background on Trudeau is this. He came to power in 2015. He was replacing Stephen Harper. Stephen Harper had been in power for, I think, like 9 years at that point. And he was a good prime minister, but there were a couple minor scandals that were going through, right? It happens with every government. That, like, every government tries to do stuff, and eventually a scandal or two will bring them down, and you get all kinds of things with that, right? And I mean, Harper had gone through the 2008 financial collapse, which affected us here in Canada, so there was some stuff from that of, like, hard decisions that he had to make and everything. But anyway, by the time 2015 came around, the country was like, it's time for a change. Enter Justin Trudeau, came in riding his father's name, because his father, Pierre Trudeau, his father.
Air quotes.
Air quotes.
So I'm gonna get my cigar out over here.
Anyway, his on paper father, we'll call it that. The one that signed the birth certificate. Pierre Trudeau was former Prime Minister of Canada, also one of the worst prime ministers we had. So Trudeau rode that name to leadership of the Liberal Party, and he ran on this change platform. Everything's going to be different. It's going to be so good. We're going to do all this stuff. And he really captured the younger crowd, right? He really energized a younger crowd. He got them out voting, and he came to power in 2015. by 2019, the next election, it was obvious that the dude needed to go. Like, within 4 years, Canada was on a downward trend in every direction. We were getting increasingly woke. Housing prices were spiraling out of control. Dollar was going down. Gas prices were up. Immigration was starting to get really out of control. And just all this stuff was piling up. And within that 4 years, there were more scandals than Stephen Harper had. And these scandals were all bigger. And somehow, he always found somebody to take the fall for every one of those scandals. So by 2019, a lot of the country was like, hey, he should go. Unfortunately, not enough of the country, so he got handed a minority government. So for the Americans that don't know, under our parliamentary system, you don't vote directly for the leader. Like in the States, you vote for the president, you vote for your congressional representative, Senate, etc., etc. In Canada, you vote for the party. So you vote for the representative for your riding. And the party with the most seats forms the government. And the leader of that party then becomes prime minister. So because there are multiple parties, we have 4 opposition parties, really kind of 5. And then there's basically like 5 or 6 parties, depending on where you sit on the spectrum here in Canada. So you got the Liberal Party, Conservatives, Bloc Québécois, New Democratic Party, and then the Green Party floats around. And then the People's Party of Canada, which doesn't even have a seat in the House. So whoever has the most seats forms the government. And if they have more than 50% of the seats, then they form what's called a majority government, and you can just pass whatever you want because you've got a mandate from the people. It's like having a congressional and a Senate majority, right? If they have fewer than 50% of the seats, but they have more seats than everybody else, they form what's called a minority, where they're still in power, they still have the prime minister, but they need the help of at least one other opposition party in order to get things passed. So in 2019, Trudeau got handed a minority government. And nobody really wanted to upset the apple cart. Minority governments don't necessarily have a long shelf life in Canada because, it's hard to, when you've got a minority, it's hard to keep everybody happy. And eventually you're going to run afoul of at least one of the other political parties, or enough of the other political parties to bring down the government. So in 2021, during COVID, Trudeau decided to prorogue Parliament, which basically means to suspend the parliamentary session. And he did this to avoid a parliamentary inquiry into I think it was like a $900 million scandal where money was funneled into personal bank accounts of Liberal Party members through the WeWork charity.
What's a WeWork, Chad? I'm familiar with in America. We have that WeWork. It's a business, like a office share type of thing.
Yeah, well, I don't know if it's a charity or not, but here in Canada, yeah, it's that company, right? So it was basically that scandal was unfolding, and he decided to call an election as soon as Parliament came back. Calling an election, and he ran on vaccine mandates, right? Of course, by that point we were full into COVID, and the fear and all the propaganda was in full swing. But he ended up with a second minority government. Basically, nothing changed. Like almost all the seat counts remained the same. Then 2022 happens, and we get the Freedom Convoy and the Emergencies Act. And everything that came out of that, the seizing of the bank accounts, the loss of any prestige Canada might have had on the world stage, the lying, the basically trying to, I guess you could say it's the lawfare against Canadian citizens, all of that, right? Political prisoners, all of that kind of stuff, should have been enough to bring down the government and have Trudeau and all his cabinet ministers resign in disgrace and then go immediately to another election. That's what should have happened. It didn't, and he managed to survive the Emergencies Act by basically hinting that it was going to be a confidence vote in the House of Commons. So what a confidence vote is, for those who don't know, under the parliamentary system, if the government puts forward a bill or a motion, they can make it a confidence motion. And if more than 50% of the members of parliament vote against that, it's considered a non-confidence vote, right? Basically the government no longer has the confidence of the House that it can carry out its mandate. That dissolves parliament. We go to an election, right? What Trudeau did in the wake of the Emergencies Act, because it has to be voted on within 7 days of its implementation, is he hinted that it was going to be a confidence vote. He didn't outright make it a confidence vote, but he hinted at it. One of the other parties, the New Democratic Party, under King of the Invertebrates, Jagmeet Singh, the NDP never has any money to go to elections. Like, they just cannot fundraise, so they always have to borrow money every election. And because of that, having an election, like, they had one in 2019, another one in 2021, so they were heavily in debt. So they couldn't afford to go to another election. So with the hint of a confidence vote, basically Jagmeet Singh got cold feet and propped up the government. After that, he entered into an arrangement with Trudeau and the Liberal Party to, basically it was called the Supply and Confidence Agreement. And he basically agreed to prop them up. And all the Liberals had to do was maybe think about advancing some NDP policies. So it's like the cheapest political bribe of all time. Didn't leverage it for a cabinet position or anything, or money for their, party war chest or anything like that. Just straight up, yeah, we'll support you guys and you don't have to do anything for us. Nobody in Canada voted for that coalition government at all. Nobody in Canada wanted that, but under the system, like, that's sort of where we're stuck. And since then, as poll numbers have slid, there's been a number of confidence votes and horrible policies put forward by the Trudeau government. And Jagmeet Singh and the NDP have propped them up on every single one. So what's happened over the last year is all of those bad ideas have started to come home to roost. Basically, the Trudeau government has been tossing rakes into the lawn, and now they're starting to walk across the grass, and no matter which way they turn, they're hitting a rake. And the main opposition party, the Conservative Party, which is polling huge, like, they have a chance to capture, like, closing in on some polls 300 seats in the House in the next election, which is gigantic. There's 338 seats in basically the House of Commons, so 300 seats is a huge margin. They've been trying to bring down the government because Canadians want an election. We want Trudeau gone. And the NDP has propped him up every single time. After the first assassination attempt against Trump, for anybody that was paying attention, that was the moment that he clinched victory, like, completely. After that, it was all just academic, really, just playing it out. But I think everybody who was watching it knew for certain that, you come at the king, you best not miss, right? That's just how it is, right? You try to take him out, that pissed a lot of people off and galvanized a lot of voters, and it got everybody out. We should have gone to an election then. If Canadian parliamentarians had any respect for Canada whatsoever, they would have seen the writing on the wall and said, okay, Trump's going to win this thing. Let's go to an election now while we have the time. And then the new government, whoever that is, will have a clear mandate from Canadians to deal with that. That didn't happen. We had multiple confidence votes in September and October to, again, bring down the government. None of them succeeded. The next biggest opportunity would have been November 6th, after Trump won for sure. Then we should have gone to an election as well. Again, nothing happened. And then now here we are. And we're stuck in this position where, I guess let me back up a little bit here. So in December is where the crisis point finally hit, where like everything fell apart for the Trudeau government. They needed to pass a fall economic statement, basically, which is the government saying like, this is how much we spent, this is how much the deficit or surplus is going to be. This is where the economy's at, right? It's basically like a health indicator of the economy. And that economic statement, sometimes it can be a confidence vote, but usually it's just like, yeah, here's us putting this forward. And it was passed 2 days, or it was tabled 2 days before Parliament was going to break for the winter break. Well, the morning of, the finance minister, who was set to deliver the economic statement, Chrystia Freeland, she suddenly resigned. And she had been one of Trudeau's closest supporters through all of this. And she was one of the main proponents of all the bad ideas that Trudeau's had. So her resignation just threw everything out the window. The whole Liberal Party in shambles. Trudeau was saying nothing. But they still had to table the economic statement. And watching Parliament that day, it was just a disaster. Just chaos. Nobody knew what was going on. Nonsense in every direction. They tabled the statement. Basically, the House leader came in and said, yeah, we're tabling the statement. And then she walked out. And then, there's nobody else on the Liberal side in the House whatsoever. So there was no debate. And once again, the NDP, under Jagmeet Singh, voted confidence on the economic statement and held up the government. After Parliament broke for the winter, they were supposed to, their next day back was supposed to be January 27th. We're talking on the 23rd right now. Just for anybody listening who wants to know the timeline here. About, I forget what day it was, but it was like 3 or 4 days after Parliament broke for the winter. Jagmeet Singh finally came out, seeing the chaos of the Liberal Party, and said, yeah, we're going to vote to bring down the government in the next confidence vote. Which we should have done, really, in December. Nothing really changed in those 4 days, except that Jagmeet Singh now gets his pension, which I can go into detail later on that. It's a little side note. Anyway, a couple weeks ago, basically the first week of January there, we heard nothing from Trudeau as all this chaos reigned. Trump started making his statements about turning Canada into the 51st state.
Yeah, let's talk about that, man.
Yeah, and I'll get to that in a minute here. I just want to give the timeline. So he was making those statements, and he made it very clear that he was going to leverage 25% tariffs against Canada unless we could get control of our border, which we'll talk about in a minute because it's related to our immigration system, which is somehow magically worse than the American immigration system.
That's saying something.
It is. And Trump actually has very good reasons for wanting us to get control of our border. And it wouldn't, it's such a simple thing. But anyway, Trudeau basically came out and said he's going to prorogue Parliament, which means he's going to suspend the parliamentary session, all bills off the table. He could only do it up until March 24th because the government has to pass a supply bill, which is basically like a funding bill, by March 31st to keep the government running. So he can only do it up to March 24th, which gives them time to pass that, right? And he did this he announced his intention to resign, and that way the Liberal Party could have a leadership race for who to replace him as Prime Minister of Canada. That's not what prorogation is supposed to be for. There's a legal challenge to that right now that's having a hearing on the February 13th and 14th. So we'll see what comes of that. But yeah, so as of this moment, Trudeau has not actually resigned. He is the Prime Minister of Canada still. I guess we could call him the squatter that's currently occupying the Prime Minister's office. He has no mandate from the people to govern. No one in his cabinet has a mandate from the people to govern. Because he's announced his intention to resign, nobody is under any obligation to negotiate with him or his cabinet. And we're just kind of stuck in this nightmare realm of zero leadership in Ottawa at the federal level. So anyway, that's the broad timeline there. I know that was a bit of a 20-minute rant, but yeah.
No. For people
I
on
got to
my
explain
side that like ignorant Americans don't know anything about Canadian politics, like that was fascinating. Like I did not have that level of detail at all. We just basically skim. We'll get like the most sensational headline, and we kind of TLDR the thing. So I appreciate that deep
Yeah.
dive.
Yeah, it's there's some important details in there because it's gonna make sense when I start talking about some other stuff there. Um, but basically, right now we are up against an existential threat. Probably the most, probably the biggest existential threat Canada has ever faced. With, and it's not hyperbole to say this could rip the country apart. It's not outside the realm of possibility that when we come through this on the other side, that we are no longer Canada, right? Whether that's we're the 51st state or every province is its own separate country. Um, and this could happen, at the speed of the collapse of the Soviet Union, right? It's basically where we're at. It's like, same thing within a year, right? It's
So why do you say that, man? Because there's a
well,
lot of people in the United States that are saying similar things about the U.S., right? So I think this sort of idea of balkanization or national divorce or some sort of split up seems to be pretty prevalent. I didn't even realize that was being talked about in Canada.
So, in the States is a little bit different because most of the people saying that are online and they don't go out. Like, as much as there are red states and blue states, when you go to people on the ground and outside of like a few enclaves of like hardcore, diehard, red or blue people, most Americans are pretty agreeable with each other, right? Like, you get outside of Los Angeles into rural California, and the people there are going to be fairly similar to your people in rural Texas, right? Like, they're going to be middle of the road, that kind of thing. Canada has this big problem of East meets West, and it has to do with us being such a sparsely populated country spread out over this massive geographical area, right? So the big two problems that we have, one is Quebec, and the other is Alberta. Alberta I don't consider a problem. Quebec I do. So Quebec has always been somewhat separatist. It's a French-speaking province. They consider themselves French. They consider themselves its own separate nation, even though they are under Confederation. They're part of Canada. But they think of themselves as their separate nation. And they have enormous political power in Canada by basically being a heavily populated area along the St. Lawrence Seaway because they were one of the first settled areas in modern Canada. And that just has to do with the St. Lawrence Seaway and French explorers coming down and settling around like Montreal area and all that, right? Just basic geography. Because of that enormous political power, they've extracted massive concessions over the years out of the political apparatus in Canada. They are not subjected to massive taxes like the rest of the country. We have this thing called equalization payments, which is basically provinces that make more money pay to give to provinces that make less money, right? Like if you're on Prince Edward Island, your economy is basically farming and fishing. You have no real natural resources beyond that. So, and half the year you can't do either because you're locked in ice and snow. So it kind of makes sense from that perspective of like, okay, well, Alberta's got this vast oil well, so that they can help Prince Edward Island, do their thing. The problem is Quebec gets the lion's share of those equalization payments to the tune of like $14-15 billion a year. Even though Quebec's economy is incredibly strong and they make a lot of money, they just get these free handouts. It's a bit like if you had $100,000 a year job and you got 80 grand from the government every year, of course you're going to be driving a much better car than your coworkers, right? And they've long wanted to separate from Canada and become their own country in truth. Because of the political divide and the chaos in Ottawa, that separatist movement is growing again and they're starting to see that like maybe being a part of Canada is not the way forward. So that's the problem on the East Coast. With the West, with Alberta has long been mistreated by Ottawa, and part of that is just being so far from Ottawa. They're far from the center of power. It's more sparsely populated, so they don't have as much representation in Ottawa. But Alberta has vast oil resources and vast other natural resources. Like there's a lot of mining, there's the oil and gas industry, which is huge there, a lot of forestry, all of that. They are one of the largest economies in Canada. And they've long been abused. The Trudeau's government has done everything they can to shut down the oil and gas industry and phase it out and basically destroy the entire economy of Alberta. They allowed wildfires to wipe out the town of Jasper, which is like a major tourist attraction, major tourist town in Alberta. It was quite beautiful. I was there a couple of years ago, and I'm glad I got to see it before it burned down. But basically, Alberta's relationship with Canada has been one of being constantly abused and taken advantage of. And with this looming trade war, Ottawa wants to shut down all oil and gas going to the United States, which would bankrupt Alberta, immediately kill their economy. So Alberta has its own separatist movement, and they've long said, like, hey, this relationship isn't working with Ottawa. We should get out while we still can, whether that's our own country or joining the United States. Something's not working here. And those calls have grown considerably louder in recent weeks, to the point where if they held a referendum, like if Trudeau goes with his plan to shut down all oil and gas going to the States, Alberta will probably hold a referendum within a week, and they'll be out of the country like that.
Wow.
Yeah. And it's just, it's an abusive relationship, and they feel they need to get out, and I do not blame them for that. Now, that being said, cutting off oil and gas to the United States would be catastrophic for the rest of Canada. We send a lot down to you guys, but we also send a lot to our East Coast. However, the lines that go through our East Coast go through Michigan. So, like I live in Sarnia, which is the oil and gas town in central Canada. It's in Ontario. If Trudeau shuts down oil and gas going out of the country, then our entire town basically will be dead within a month, because we won't have any fuel coming. And because we won't have any fuel, that means every province east of Saskatchewan, which is more than half the country and the most populous half the country, will not have gas within about a week.
That's crazy.
Yeah, it would be probably the greatest act of economic suicide in human history. It would just be like, that would be the end of the country. It'd be $40-$50 a liter for gas incredibly quickly, and then once that's gone, like, that would be it. The entire economy brought to a complete standstill, and like, that would be that. There's no way back from that without doing some illegal stuff. Yeah.
So they back off of that pretty quickly then. So that the impact we felt so much, people would completely lose their minds, right? Like there's no way they would continue with that policy.
You would think that, right? That would, like, if you were a reasonable person, you would look at that and go, well, yeah, like, that's a stupid policy. That's suicide. Why would you do that? Remember what I said? We're dealing with the most retarded people in human history.
I do remember you said that, yes.
Yeah. So, there's this trade spat between the U.S. and Canada. Trump wants to impose tariffs unless we get control of our border, which getting control of our border would be good for us as well, because we get a lot of gangs bringing guns up here, and the gun crime's out of control. Toronto's turning into Chicago, which is so.
Well, hold on a second. The guns are illegal, man. There's no way that can happen. You got to be lying to me.
Yeah. But anyway, like, that would be the smart thing. It's like, okay, well, we'll just get control of the border. Problem is, Parliament's prorogued, and Parliament is the governing body that would have to pass any measures to increase security at the border, including financial stuff, right? So we have no ability to do that. So the next best thing that the Trudeau government has decided to do is counter tariffs, right? Basically, we're going to go dollar for dollar, but because our dollar is basically 40 cents less than the US dollar, we're going to end up being more than dollar for dollar, and impose tariffs on goods coming in from the United States, right? Again, economic suicide. One of the things that Trudeau suggested that, maybe we could do to get back at the rascally Americans is switch from Heinz ketchup to French's ketchup.
Are you
right?
kidding me?
The problem is both are manufactured in Canada, right? So you're not boycotting anything because the product's not shipped from the United States. It's shipped from, like, French's is made in Quebec, I think, and
Right.
Heinz is made in Leamington, Ontario. So all we're doing is just shooting ourselves in the foot even more, right? So that's the level of retards that we're dealing with here. Yeah. And these people have spent the last decade killing every energy and natural resource project that we've ever tried. So there are no pipelines that run through Eastern Canada that are entirely within Canada. So we can't get our oil and gas from Alberta to the East Coast or to Tidewater in that direction. And we have the Trans Mountain pipeline that could get oil and gas to the West Coast, except that because of a certain bill, you can't, there are massive restrictions on bringing tankers onto the West Coast of Canada. So you can't even ship it anywhere from there. Right? So it's just like anything that we do here, it's economic suicide. And given how we've been taxed to death and abused the last decade under Trudeau with the cost of living as is, there's no way anybody can survive more than a couple months of a completely stalled economy. Like we're not just talking about a stagnant economy here. We're talking about an economy where nothing runs. Right? Like there are no delivery trucks. There are no, everything is just shut down. And of course, we're in the middle of winter, right? So we're not even in the growing season. And there won't be another harvest of food until July at the earliest, maybe. Right? So like it's just, but that's what I mean when I say it has the potential to end Canada as a country.
Wow, that's surprising to me. I didn't realize it was that bad. When I first saw the headlines, I thought it was just some ha LOL kind of. Particularly the way Trump does things, he'll half the time he's not serious. He just says some shit.
Yeah.
And this feels like this is actually legitimately serious.
Yeah. Well, he was talking at Davos today about how he doesn't need Canadian oil and gas. It's like, well, if you didn't need Canadian oil and gas, you wouldn't have restarted the Keystone XL pipeline. So, like, it's all just bluster, right? That's how he negotiates. The problem is he hates Trudeau, and he hates everyone that Trudeau sends. And he knows, because Trudeau signaled that he's going to resign, Trump and everyone in his administration is like, why would we bother negotiating with you? You're going to be gone in 2 months. Like, we'll just wait till whoever your successor is. Like that's, so we're basically just stuck. And I think 80% of the country at this point wants an election. And just the egos involved from Trudeau and the Governor General and everybody is preventing us from having that election to deal with this crisis. Yeah, it's bad. It's monumentally stupid.
So what do you predict is going to happen, man?
I don't know. Here's the thing. I'm of two minds of this, right? If, like, the Canada's worth fighting for if it's the type of Canadians that went to Ottawa in a convoy of trucks in a, on a frozen January weekend 3 years ago, right? Like, that's Canada at its best. The Canada that's like, no, we're not going to deal with tyranny. We're going to stand up to it. We're going to do it peacefully. And, we're going to show you that you're wrong. Just have the conversation with us, right? Like if that's Canada at its best. And if we're going to be that Canada, then I'm all for making a fight out of it. But if we're just going to carry on with this liberal nonsense and economic suicide, then let's just raise the American flag over Ottawa and be done with it and save us all a lot of misery, right?
Man, is that possible? Like, I think about that, and just the way you were describing it, it seems very anti-American. I know what you're saying, right? Like
Yeah,
the trucker convoy, but like you know the way Canada's got the reputation of being super very polite, right? We don't have guns. We're kind of polite. So as long as
yeah,
it's not violent, whereas America was sort of our tradition was born from violence, right? Like we had a violent revolution against the Brits. We've had the
yeah.
Second Amendment. We all have guns. Like it feels like there might be an incompatibility there in mindset. What do you think, dude?
Well, and I actually had this thought today because I was thinking about the conversation earlier that we were going to have on the podcast. And remember, you've seen the movie Sicario?
I have not actually.
Surprising. It's a good movie. It's been out for a little while. I
I'll
would
have to put it on my Netflix watch
highly,
list.
highly recommend. Anyway, for those that have seen the movie Sicario, this isn't going to be a spoiler for you. It's just going to be a line of dialogue. There's a line of dialogue at the end where Alejandro, played by Benicio del Toro, he tells Kate, who's played by Emily Blunt, he's like, "You should leave. This is the land of wolves now, and you will not survive." Right.
Mm.
So we have this reputation as Canadians of being polite, but really it's just meekness, right? We're running away from fights where we don't want to get into the fights, right? Like the scrappy, um, I guess the scrappy, gritty, like cowboy culture that moved across the country, that all is gone. Like that died around World War II. Like after World War II, like that's where we moved away from that. So it's not politeness, it's meekness, right? Nobody wants to fight because nobody knows how to fight. But
Oh, that's interesting. I think
yeah,
I don't know if you've seen like Jordan Peterson talks a lot about this, about
yeah,
being you should be a dangerous person
yeah,
who has it under control voluntarily. Otherwise, there's no virtue in it there. It
yeah,
just means that you're ineffectual and weak.
yeah. So one of my favorite books has a line where it's like, it's one thing to be a good person because that's who you are, but it's another thing to be a good person because you're too much of a pussy to break the rules,
Yes,
right?
exactly.
And that's what we are, is we're too afraid to break the rules. But you have to look at the wider geopolitical situation of where we are right now. Like, the UK is gone. You look at what's happening there. They no longer share our values. You look at the stuff with the grooming gangs and their response to it, where free speech is terrorism and terrorism is to be protected. And if you say anything bad about the people that are committing that terrorism, then you're going to jail because you're stirring up violence or whatever.
Shout out
right?
Tommy Robinson.
Yeah, right. And I mean the Southport killer just got sentenced today for 52 years, which is about a quarter as many as he should have been sentenced for. So the UK is no longer an ally of ours, right? They don't share our values, even though we are part of the Commonwealth. If the king's not going to do anything to shut that down and basically like flip over tables and arrest everybody in their own parliament, then the king doesn't matter, right? Like if why are you even there if you're not going to help your nation out in this crisis point? The rest of Europe is going the same way. Mass censorship, the surveillance, all of that stuff. Full communism. Same reasons. They're not as far gone as the UK is yet, but they're getting close. I mean, Germany's definitely close. The only exception really is Poland. And I guess Italy.
I gotta say, I was shocked at the Netherlands too when they tried the climate activists. They all are not activists, but in the government, right? Where they
Yeah.
went after the farmers. Farmers in the Netherlands stepped up, man, in a big way, very similar to what the Canadians did with the convoy.
Yeah, I think we inspired them. I think that happened just after our convoy. So, it was good to see. But, you know what I mean? Like, Europe can no longer be counted on as an ally. And now we've got our next closest ally, who should be our, like rock solid brothers in arms, the United States, telling us that they want to take us over and that we're basically useless, right? So, to quote from Lord of the Rings, our list of allies grows thin. And, the geopolitical threats, like we've got China. We've got Khalistani separatists here in Canada. There's the various terrorism that comes out of the Middle East. We've got Russia that we're somehow going to counter. Now we got to deal with the United States. We can't even put a full division of troops in the field at one time. We have the firepower to go up against like fishing boats at sea, right? Like if you manage to put 4 fishing boats together, you could have a serious run at the Canadian Navy, and
Wow.
it'd be an even fight, right? Like the idea that we're gonna somehow defend this vast territory in the Arctic with what we have, with no allies at our back, is laughable. So that's why I say, like, this is the land of wolves, and we will not survive it, right? Unless we make some very drastic changes.
Yeah. So how would you see that marriage, assuming it took place, panning out? Because I'm worried, right? Because similar to what we're talking about, like I think, and I know some great Canadians. Please don't take this the wrong way. But I also know a lot of Canadians, right? And it is, there's like a huge cohort, which is like you talked about, just ineffectual, weak, no will, rollover, and also that snitching on your neighbor thing, like during the pandemic, like that was real too. So we look on Canadians as a whole with a little bit of derision. There's like these bright spots, great examples. But as a whole, you look at like, man, do we really want to assimilate that into our culture? Because frankly, America is suffering from the same thing. We got the same type of rot that's going on. And it feels like to me like that, instead of, inoculating y'all against some of that stuff, it feels like it might just hasten our decline and sort of slouch towards that socialist mindset and that weakness, right?
Yeah, it wouldn't make Canada better, but it would make America worse. Like you wouldn't want to hand Toronto any voting power whatsoever. The only way I could see it working is if you carved Canada into territories, much like the Virgin Islands or Puerto Rico, where like, yeah, you're part of the states, but you don't have any voting rights, and you can send people to Congress to sit there and watch, but they're not allowed to vote on stuff, right? That's the only way I could see it working. And I mean, you go to the problem of taxation without representation. The thing is, if you guys annexed us and turned us into a territory, we would probably pay about 70% less tax than we do currently, right?
Probably,
So it's like we currently don't have representation because everybody that's supposed to represent us is just stealing all the taxpayer money and then going, we don't have enough stuff to pay for anything, we'll raise taxes. Right. So
you'd also have to get used to the healthcare thing, man, because believe me, we have a different system here.
You do, but yours is actually better than ours.
For sure. Well, I keep telling people that, and they like to get angry at me, but all you have to do is look at some of the. Well, there's a couple of things like there's a very famous guy. I'm not sure if you know who it is, Stefan Molyneux. He was
I've heard the name.
He was a very famous guy on YouTube for a while. He had billions of views. Like he was like an anarchist, like libertarian philosopher type of dude. He ended up getting like a really aggressive form of cancer in his neck. And if he would have stayed in the Canadian healthcare system, he would have died. Like he had to leave the country, go to Oklahoma, get his treatment. And so I think when you have like a serious condition like that, that's when the cracks in the system start to manifest or become the most noticeable. The other piece that's really alarming is this whole MAID thing. It's like, hey, are you feeling a little depressed there, Mark? Have you considered killing yourself? It's like at that point, you're like, what it's showing you is that you can't have something that's both free and unlimited, right? And so, and high quality, right? These things are actually mutually exclusive. I think in America, yes, things are more expensive, but also the cost isn't quite as abstracted from us as it is from you, because it's like from you, it comes out of taxes, so everyone says, "Oh, it's free." In the U.S., you have to pay your premiums out of and it's not. We don't pay that in taxes, but we actually pay the insurance company. But we're not actually procuring directly from the provider. It like has to go through this weird bureaucracy of intermediaries and stuff. So it's not like it's a free market, but it's a little bit more of a free market and much better quality than in Canada. But it costs some money.
Yeah, and I mean that's the thing, right? It costs us a phenomenal amount of money as well. we just see it as taxes. We don't see it as directly like, oh, here's a bill, right? But to give a recent example, like I recently had to get my ears flushed, just earwax buildup, right? It happens. Um, couldn't get like no walk-in clinic. It's not something I can go into the emergency room for. Um, it was going to be a week to get an appointment, and it was going to cost me $50. And it's like, that sounds maybe to you guys like, oh, it's going to cost $50 or whatever, right? That's nothing. But it used to be covered under our health insurance plan, the Ontario health insurance plan. And like I used to be able to just walk into a walk-in clinic and get it done, in and out in half an hour, no problem, right? Can't even do that anymore. It's a week-long wait time. Emergency room, say you cut your hand on a piece of glass, right? And you're bleeding out, you go to the emergency room. You might be waiting 16 hours just to see someone, right? Like it's, you got a heart condition or something, or kidney stone or whatever. You could be sitting there for days in the emergency room just waiting to go see a doctor. Like it's a mess, right? To get scans, it's a months long wait. Cancer, anything like that, to get cancer treatments, you could theoretically be waiting years, right? But you don't have years, right? It's not one of those things like, well, I just won't drive my car for a while until I can afford to get it fixed, right? It's like
Just push pause on the cancer. It'll be there when the appointment rolls around.
Yeah, and like there's people that are dying because they can't get treatment within a reasonable time window, right? And it's, sure, we don't pay maybe quite as much as the United States, but when you're dying of cancer, would you rather pay $4,000 in a premium to get treatment in a timely manner, or would you rather just die because you can't, right? Like that's
Yeah, then you start talking about perverse incentives from the government too, because they actually want you to die. Kind of, it's like, when you're dead, like you're no longer a drain on the system. Goodbye.
Well, and that's the thing with the medically assisted in dying, which is probably the most evil thing this country has ever done, and that's saying something considering some of the stuff in our history. It was one of those things where it was sold with good intentions, right? Like, oh, if you have a terminal illness, you can just, rather than die agonizingly over months, we can just empathetically put you down, right? And end your suffering. And of course it was sold as like, oh, it's only going to be those few cases, and then like it's not going to do anything. Next thing you know, there's 30,000 people that have been put on that program, and it's expanded to cover poverty and depression, and it's used to clean out the medical system, right? You're taking too many resources. Can we recommend MAID? And like, have you tried just killing yourself, right? Like it's such an insidious evil, and it's done.
That's not even killing yourself. Hey,
Yeah.
Would you consider letting us kill you if we're going to be specific here, like, or be accurate?
Yeah. And you see, like the doctors. There's been some undercover footage released of interviews with these doctors, and they are so happy to administer this service, right? Like there's smiles on their faces and everything. Like you can see the glee at them doing
Ghastly.
it. Right?
God.
Yeah. Oh, it's evil. It's incredibly evil, right? It's on the level of evil with Hitler and Stalin and Pol Pot and all the rest, right? Like it's that same level of just, murder with a smile. Yeah.
Yeah, that's rough, man. It's terrible too, because there are people who legitimately could benefit from that. I think it's pretty ghastly to be like, look, I've got terminal cancer. I'm in pain from the moment I wake up until the moment I close my eyes at night, and there's no hope of recovering. I'm gonna die. You're prolonging my agony and like not helping somebody out in that situation. Like anyone who has any empathy would admit, like it would be better just to assist somebody in dying. But to your point, there's always somebody in the background that's either evil or thinking they're being pragmatic. They're just like, perhaps, and then they start thinking about this might be a solution. Then you start pushing it on people. And then I think there are the psychopaths or sociopaths who like legitimately enjoy killing people. And I'm like looking at the medical profession, like what happened to first do no harm, right? Like the Hippocratic Oath, like whether that be a lot of these things they're doing on kids now in the United States, this affirming care, and we seem to have lost the plot in the medical field.
Well, I think the principal lesson of the 21st century is that our empathy has been weaponized against us.
Mm.
Because everything is, well, empathy, right? You know, you see it with Trump deporting all the illegal immigrants, right? Like, it's something that has to happen. You're here illegally, you gotta go, right? It's unfortunate. You know, you were led to believe that through this network of NGOs and all this dark money and everything that you could just come here. That's not the case. You got to go. And of course, the first thing the media runs to is like, look at this crying child, right? You don't want to send this crying child back, do you? It's like, well, look at this murderer that's just gone on a murder spree that was here illegally, right? Like, we gotta get rid of them both. Sorry, that's just how it is. And it's across the board. You see it with the trans kids thing, right? Like, oh, these kids might commit suicide. Might. So we gotta sterilize them and perform these horrible surgeries on them, lest they maybe do something in the future, right? It's just weaponized empathy again and again and again. And you look at every argument for every piece of horrible legislation, it's the same thing. You wouldn't want people to suffer, would you?
Yeah, I don't think it's empathy though. Like it is like the ostensibly it's weaponized empathy, but I think people
Yeah.
are just being pussies about stuff. Like people don't
Yeah.
want to. They don't want to put their hand up and be like, "Wait a fucking second," right? Like nobody wants to do that. I actually had Gabrielle Clark on my show earlier this week, and she sued. Right? She had that like woke bullshit in her kid's school, and she sued and she won. And there's so many people out there who don't do that, who just like think like, well, someone's going to think I'm a bad person. Someone's going to think I don't have empathy. And it completely hijacks our ability to fucking look at something objectively with some common sense and being like, hell no, there's a boundary here. People just seem to lack that ability to set that boundary. It's frustrating as hell.
Yeah, I think more what I was getting at was like the side of the people that are trying to do these horrible things is they've turned our empathy against us, right?
Yep.
Is what it is more what it is, right? And yeah, you're right. Like, absolutely, more people need to stand up and say like, no, this is nonsense. We're not doing this. This is a horrible thing. You know, I think one of the big things in Canada here that's suffered from this was the legalization of weed, right?
Tell me more.
So I think it was, what was it, 2017 when it came in? Can't remember the exact year.
Do you have a recreational legalization, like a full-on, like making it legal, or is it like medicinal, or there's some sort of regulation, or
fully legal? So it for a long time it was decriminalized, right? Like unless you had huge amounts on you, they would take it away from you and send you on your way, whatever, right? And then with the Trudeau government, they came in and said, like, no, we're going to completely legalize it and we'll tax it and we'll make all this money off the tax revenue, right? And most people in the country went, okay. I mean, a lot of people are just doing it recreationally. So, if we're going to do it, then let's just make some tax money off it. And same thing with alcohol, whatever, right? Save some law enforcement fees and all that. And very rapidly, it went from legalizing weed to legalizing all drugs. And now, much like you see in California or some of the inner cities, you've got homeless people all over the streets shooting up. You've got the safer supply system, which basically turns the Canadian government into the largest drug dealer in Canada.
What's that? Tell me about the safer supply system.
So in order to combat the opioid crisis, they didn't want needles all over the streets because, well, people walking, right? There's a lot of bad stuff that can happen if you get pricked with a used needle, like bloodborne pathogens, et cetera, right? So the Canadian government, and of course you have to deal with the fentanyl as well, right? You have opioids laced with fentanyl, and fentanyl can kill you in very small amounts. So the government of Canada decided that they were going to take it on and supply the drugs so that people weren't going to overdose on fentanyl and that there wouldn't be needles everywhere. Well, you might be surprised to learn that drug use exploded and now overdoses are through the roof. We got tons of homeless people just sleeping on the street, again, just shooting up in every direction. Needles everywhere. Public parks are overrun. Anywhere around these safer supply sites, and then like they were setting them up next to schools. There's a few of them next to schools and playgrounds, etc. Right, so of course those then become no-go zones for parents. Um, and what are people doing with the opioids? Well, they're going to a clinic, they're getting the opioids, and then they're turning them around and selling them on the street, right? Because they can just get them for free from the Canadian government. They're making cash, and then what are they doing with that cash? They're going to get some stronger stuff and getting high off on that. And that all started with the legalization of weed. So slippery slope. And, you know, because weed was legalized, it was like, okay, well, what's next, right? Psychedelics? Well, psychedelics aren't harmful. Oh, well, everybody's doing these opioids and we've got this big crisis, so let's just make that a little safer. And then here we are. Now it's human tragedy.
Yeah, that's tough, man. Because I'm
Yeah.
I'm a libertarian, man. Like
Yeah.
I think most of the second order effects of drugs, alcohol, whatever it is, come from prohibition around them, right? So even if you de facto decriminalize something, you're not making it legal.
Yeah.
So meaning, like if you were in a pure free market, right? Like anybody could sell any product they wanted to, but they were also opening themselves up to liability too. If you harm somebody, you sell a product that's dangerous, whatever, people can sue you. You can come after them for damages, right? There should be stores that are open that people can sell whatever they want. This is my view. This is
Yeah.
please. I realize I'm an outlier, but at that point you can, you know, customers are going to want to know what's in them. The problem with black markets, like you said, with the fentanyl, that was a big issue, is that there used to be heroin that you sort of knew kind of what it was, and then all of a sudden fentanyl was so cheap to manufacture they just put it in literally everything.
Yeah.
Whereas if you had a store, a reputable store, like, you know, to think of it like weed stores now, like 25 years ago that would be unheard of to think about a cannabis retail store. We have them everywhere, and the model works where they on the package it has, have you ever gone to one of these stores? It says CBD, THC, AP, like all these friggin' like a complete chemical analysis of, you know exactly what you're going to get. You know the potency, you know if it's sativa or an indica, you like all this stuff around it. And I think customers want that. That's something that they actually really desire. They want to. Nobody wants to OD.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to have a bad experience. And I think that the fact that you push things onto the street is really one of the things that causes a lot of problems, because black market dealers, they don't give a shit, like, and you can't really ask, like, you can't, you know, like, and if somebody harms you or whatever, you can't go to the authorities. There's no sort of like, it's just really this gray zone. I think putting it out in the open and putting you know, just completely codifying, like, this is real, like this, like, we're going to sell this like we sell anything else, that would cure a lot of the problems. That said, I'm not one of these people that thinks it's a panacea, that thinks that if you legalize everything, even on the strictures that I sort of laid out, like, there's not going to be problems with it. I'm not generally somebody who thinks that substances are generally a net positive for society, right? I definitely agree with you. Even weed, right? I think a lot of people look at weed now, and it's been so normalized that people think that there's no negative effects to it, and then the literature just doesn't bear that out, right? Like, it has a ton of negative consequences potentially, a lot of positives too. Particularly if you just go straight CBD and you ingest it a certain way. RSO oil is a miracle cure for people with epilepsy. There's a ton of really positive benefits, but on net, if you're doing it recreationally, you're probably making yourself kind of dumb. You have some health outcomes that are not necessarily great. So I don't want to have my statements mean like I'm advocating for drugs. I'm not. Like, I think generally they're net negative, except for, I will say, psychedelics. I'm somebody who's a huge advocate for the right person who wants to do them. I'm not saying, you know, recommending anyone go do them, but I think they have potential. And I think the literature bears this out. You look at Johns Hopkins University, the great work Roland Griffiths has done over there. You've got Robin Carhart Harris, Imperial College London. All this research around the psychological benefits. of psychedelics, it's overwhelming, and I think there's a place for it. And one of the things I don't like about things being illegal is that you can't even experiment at that point. Like you can't have legitimate scientists
Yeah.
performing research that is going to help people. So generally, this is a huge rant, but I'm generally opposed to drug prohibition. I don't think it's great. I don't think it worked for alcohol in the United States. We ended up with gangs and black markets and people killing each other, and it's questionable product. And I just don't like that generally. So that's just my take on it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm nominally with you there on the libertarian principle, right? Like on principle, I would be in favor of like, yeah, as long as you're not hurting anybody else, do whatever you want. Um, the unfortunate reality is that we are now in this situation where like, yep, those drugs are hurting a lot of other people that wouldn't have otherwise been hurt, right? Like the culture around it, the mess that it's created. And I think part of that is not just like you said, if it was just decriminalized and you weren't going to go to jail if you got caught with, a little bit of coke on you or whatever, if that was just the case, I think I'd probably be a little more okay with it. But the fact that the government is now supplying it for free to people, I think is really where the problem lies.
Still that from Ronald Reagan, man. Ronald
Yeah.
Reagan was pumping crack via the CIA into American inner cities in the 80s, man. You
Well,
gotta.
didn't Biden try to do that with the free crack pipes?
Well, that was just paraphernalia. I think that there's,
Yeah.
and I get what they're trying to do. For example, instead of sharing needles, like providing
Yeah.
people needles and like whatever, like I get from a harm reduction standpoint what people are trying to do. I think oftentimes it doesn't really do any good. I think ultimately, people that are going to, shoot heroin or fentanyl or whatever it's going to be, they're either on two tracks. They're going to get some help, they're going to pull out, or they're going to die. Like
Yeah.
that's just the two tracks we're on.
Yeah, and I think we've seen that. I think we have enough real world data to show that those kind of harm reduction things have been a net negative, and it's not close. I think the data bears that out. Um, anyway, that actually leads me the fentanyl thing and the drug thing here in Canada actually leads me to what I wanted to talk about with regards to immigration and the border, because this feeds into why Trump has come after Canada so hard and why that relationship has now been torn to shreds. Um,
Man does like borders.
he does, and I get it, right? Um, the problem here with Canada is that our immigration system under Trudeau was the basically open door policy. When he got elected, he came out with this thing that we're now the first post-national state, and everybody went, "We didn't vote for that." Like, also, what does that even mean?
Yeah, what does that mean?
Right?
Are we all citizens of the world, man?
As it turned out, that meant all the world could be citizens of Canada.
Oh, wow.
And
Okay.
what's happened in that time is every terrorist group, drug cartel, or hostile nation has just dumped millions of people into the Canadian system. And now we've got just like multiple competing tribes of bad actors here in Canada. Right, and nothing's been done about it. There's no like deportation. Policing isn't there. The immigration system isn't even keeping track of people. So we have tons
So
of
what,
people.
they just import, they come in on a visa and then the government just stops tracking them? Just like, stay as long as you want, or what?
Essentially, so one of the things that it started with was student visas, right? They increased the number of student visas by a huge amount. So what happened is we got a bunch of Indian nationals that came over, and they started what are called diploma mills, right? These are your strip mall colleges. It's an office in a strip mall that is one conference room that somehow has 20,000 students, right? And you can sign up at this little university, you pay them 10 grand or whatever, and they sign everything that you need to come across on a student visa. And those people come across and then they just disappear. They don't go to classes or anything. They're just in Canada on that visa, never seen by law enforcement again, right? That's one way. Asylum seekers, right? We have no quality control on our asylum program, really. So you can just put whatever you want on the form. Like we have students whose visas are now expiring because they've started cracking down on that a little bit. And they say, like, okay, my visa expires on this date, so a week before I'm going to go claim asylum. And then they, because of the system so backed up, they could be here 5-10 years waiting for that asylum claim to process. And then, of course, much like in the States, the hearing process, there's no guarantee they're going to show up on the date that they've been told to show up. And we're not screening any of those people. We've taken in a lot of Palestinians. There's been no screening done to make sure they're not part of Hamas or anything like that. We just took in 5,000 more. Same problem. No screening, no quality control. We've got a lot of Khalistani separatists. This is a group out of India. These are the Sikhs that they want to carve out their own state in India. They come over here and they've infiltrated the political system, and now they're starting to carve out their own enclaves here in Canada. Indians are doing the same thing. Everybody's just kind of scamming the system, and all of this is just under the federal government, right? Like, it's not. So in the States, you have people just walk across the border and then whatever, or you did have people just walk across the border and they could just come in and do whatever. Here, because it's all being done under what's called essentially a legal process, there's no real oversight or tracking to it, or it's just like rubber stamped. Okay, you're here legally, no problem. And then these people just do whatever they want. And one of the big things that they love doing is running drugs and guns across the Canadian and US border, because it's the longest undefended border in the world. It's like 9,000 miles of undefended border, most of it wilderness, right? And it's a great way, if you're a terrorist group and you want to get terrorists into the United States, well, the southern border is being watched.
Yep.
Under Biden, it wasn't really a problem because they would help you across. But under Trump, that's now changed. But at the Canadian border was never watched the same way the southern border was, because you had a few people, but it wasn't really that big of a deal. Most Canadians respected the border and would cross at legal crossings. You'd get the odd person, but whatever. Now it's just in droves, right? So you could land a terrorist cell in Canada, and then you could just walk across to Minnesota or wherever, and you're into the United States. So it's a huge security risk for the United States. And because there's no oversight, the Trudeau government's not interested in doing anything about it. Trump has every right to demand that we get control of our immigration system, right? And of course, by doing so, we would be getting a lot of these drugs and guns off the street as well. We'd be clamping down on these terrorist cells, and it would be a net benefit to Canada to clamp down on this system. And that's all Trump wants, right? Everything else, the tariffs, the 51st state is mostly bluster.
You think so? Because look at what he's doing with Greenland, right? And I get it's not exactly the same thing. Greenland has got strategic importance from a military perspective. It's got, there's other reasons to do it, right? But I'm looking at the mineral deposits, the oil, all these things, and I think Canada is very similar to where you guys are so covered in snow. And I think, as we know, that if things start melting a little bit more, you get more access to things. Like, over time, Canada might be a really attractive thing from a natural resources standpoint. In the United States, it has enough resources. We stop bombing the shit out of every third world country on the planet. Maybe we could extract some resources, maybe make it profitable. So I think it might be his eyeballs might be looking that direction, particularly rare earth minerals. Now that we're talking about EVs and all these sort of things, I think it became a lot more attractive. And so I wonder if this is a ploy to sort of make a land grab, literally.
I don't necessarily know if it's a land grab, but I have a theory about this, and I can't necessarily confirm it because I don't think he's going to come right out and say it. But you look at a map, right? So you look at the map, you look at a geopolitical situation. The big problem with the United States is moving things from the Atlantic to the Pacific and vice versa. Because without the Panama Canal, you got to go all the way around South America, and that is a long trip down and back up. And there's a lot that can happen there. You're talking weeks to move a single battle group, around that. why he's going after the Panama Canal is precisely for that reason. He's setting it up, and again, this is theory. If things become hot with China and become hot with Russia, you need the ability to move men and material quickly from Atlantic to Pacific, wherever that threat is, and ships are the best way to do it. With the Panama Canal, he needs that under U.S. control, because to try and take control of that in the middle of a war is going to be quite the thing. Like just building the Panama Canal, I don't know if you know the story about that, but that cost huge amounts of men and materials, and like
A lot
the
of
cost
dead
in
people
lives.
there.
Oh yeah, like those locks are built with a mountain of corpses. But again, the vulnerability there is you take out one set of locks and the whole Panama Canal is useless until it gets repaired. The other way to move men and material via shipping is the Northwest Passage, right? Because Canada's Navy can be taken out with 3 dudes in a fishing boat, we have no ability to secure the Canadian High Arctic whatsoever, to secure that Northwest Passage. So Russia or China or whoever else, the UK, can just move. They can operate at will in the Northern Arctic, and there's nothing the United States can do about it. And to fight your way through the Arctic, I mean, if you have to break ice, because even the Northwest Passage, like even if you have an icebreaker, right, your ships are trapped in narrow lanes. That's not exactly ideal combat conditions. So if you had a willing geopolitical partner that could secure that and hold it, and you could be confident that they could hold that, then you don't have a problem. But because Canada does not have that ability, you look at a map and it's like, well, if you guys aren't going to do it, then we're going to have to do it, right? I mean, yeah, there's the stuff with the minerals and everything like that, but I think a lot of it is just the strategic picture and the long-term strategic outlook. I think if Canada built a couple of carrier battle groups, Trump would probably back off a little bit. I mean, not that we're going to build them in 4 years. We're not even going to get... I don't even think we could hire a designer in 4 years to build a ship, to be honest. But yeah, I think that's my theory anyway, that he's looking at with all this stuff with Greenland and the Panama Canal, etc. It's just the wider geopolitical strategic picture.
Interesting, man. I hadn't thought about that angle before. Well, hey, dude, I'm getting up at a hard stop at the bottom of the hour, dude. But we
right.
could have kept going for a long time. Thank you for stopping by. Thank you for bringing the Canadian perspective, man. Always good to talk to our neighbors up north.
Yeah, glad I could be here. Thanks for having me back on. It's been a bit since I've done a long form conversation, so thanks for having me, man.
Yeah, anytime. I'm definitely gonna have you back in the future, man. Plenty of things we could have dove into, so we'll keep the conversation going.
Yeah, I mean, if we're all still alive by the end of the summer, then I'm happy to come back and see where everything's panned out.
Big if, yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, thanks for having me.
Yes, sir. Talk to you later, man.
Yeah, have a good one.